The room didn't gasp. It didn't whisper. It went completely, terrifyingly still. Prince Harry stood there, frozen in a way cameras could never quite capture. His jaw tightened. His eyes glistened. And for a split second, the man who once stormed out of palaces and interviews alike looked like a child hearing something he was never supposed to hear out loud. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because the words had already been spoken. And once spoken, they could never be taken back. What could possibly be so final, so severe, that the king's own sister had to be the one to say it? Not an aide, not a private memo, not a quiet leak to the press, but Princess and herself, standing firm, delivering a message that landed like a blow to the chest. Here's the question no one was prepared to answer in that moment. What kind of last wish makes a son go silent instead of fighting? This wasn't a rumor. It wasn't palace gossip dressed up for clicks. This was a decision described as deliberate, confirmed, and painfully intentional. A final boundary drawn not in anger, but in resolve. And the most shocking part wasn't the content of the wish. It was Harry's reaction to it. He didn't interrupt. He didn't object. He didn't even look up. Why? If this story were about revenge, Harry would have pushed back. If it were about punishment, there would have been resistance. Harry has never been known for restraint when it comes to defending his wife or challenging the institution he believes wronged him. So why now? Why this silence? That's where the timing becomes impossible to ignore. Behind palace walls, preparations were already underway. Quiet conversations, legal language, carefully chosen messengers. When the word last starts appearing in royal documents, it changes everything. It means there is no appeal left, no rewrite, no future meeting to smooth things over. This wasn't about optics. This wasn't about press coverage. This was about legacy. Funerals, especially royal ones, are not just ceremonies. They are statements. They decide who belongs in the final chapter and who doesn't. And someone, somewhere, had decided that one presence would change the story in a way that could never be undone. Harry knew that. You could see it on his face. His grief wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was the kind that sits heavy in the chest, the kind that forces you to swallow words you want to scream, because saying them would only make things worse. And then there was Princess Anne. Calm, measured, unflinching. She didn't soften the message. She didn't dramatize it either. She delivered it like a duty she never asked for, but fully accepted. And that alone tells us something crucial. This decision wasn't sudden. It had been considered, revisited, locked in. And as Harry stood there, barely holding back tears, one truth became painfully clear. What and said next wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the confirmation of something decided long ago. Why Princess Anne? That was the question hanging in the air the moment the weight of those words settled. Of all the people who could have spoken, of all the voices that could have delivered the king's final instruction, why her? The answer isn't comforting. Princess Anne doesn't speak unless the decision is already irreversible. She isn't sent to test reactions. She isn't used to soften blows. When Anne steps forward, it means discussion is over. The choice has been made. The ink is dry, and everyone in that room knows it, whether they like it or not. That's why the silence deepened when she stood. No rustling papers, no murmurs, no one daring to shift in their seat. And didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her authority didn't come from emotion. It came from trust. She has always been the one the king relied on when emotions threatened to cloud judgment. The one who could carry out a task without personal indulgence, without spectacle, without weakness. And that mattered here. Because this wasn't a family conversation. It was an execution of will. She didn't explain the background. She didn't offer context. She didn't try to justify the decision in moral terms. She delivered it plainly, almost clinically, as though explanation itself would only invite argument. And yet, everyone understood. This wasn't Anne's opinion. This wasn't Anne's preference. This was Anne acting as the final safeguard. You could feel it in the way the room reacted. No one looked to Harry for confirmation. No one waited for a response. Because this wasn't a debate. It was a line drawn so clearly that crossing it was no longer an option. And then there was Harry. If you've watched him over the years, you know his tells. The sharp inhale before he speaks. The tightening of his shoulders when he's about to push back. The flash of defiance when he feels cornered. None of that happened. Instead, he looked down. Not in shame. In recognition. That's the part people missed. This wasn't the reaction of a man blindsided. This was the reaction of a man who already knew the answer, but hoped, against all reason, that it might somehow change. Think about that for a second. What kind of information makes someone stop arguing before the fight even starts? Harry didn't ask why. He didn't demand an explanation. And that alone tells us something devastating. The reason had already been discussed. Privately, painfully, and in a way that left no room for denial. Anne's role wasn't to convince Harry. It was to make it official. And as she finished speaking, there was a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, where Harry's hands clenched. Just for a second, like he was holding on to something fragile, something already slipping away, because he understood what this meant. This wasn't about exclusion. It was about control. And more importantly, it was about preventing something from happening later when no one would be able to stop it. But what was that something? And why did Harry accept it without a single word of protest? Because the real reason behind the king's last wish had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with what funerals truly decide. A funeral isn't about goodbye. That's the lie people cling to because the truth is harder to face. A funeral is about control. Control of memory. Control of imagery. Control of what becomes permanent once the cameras are gone and history decides what it will remember. And that is why the king's last wish wasn't casual, emotional, or impulsive. It was strategic in a way only someone raised inside the machinery of monarchy could fully understand. Royal funerals are not private moments of grief. They are global broadcasts. Every movement is dissected. Every expression becomes a headline. Every presence is interpreted as approval, reconciliation, or forgiveness, whether it was intended that way or not. Attendance equals legitimacy, and legitimacy, once granted, can never be taken back. That is the part that made this decision unavoidable. Because once someone stands there, once they are photographed, once they are placed in the frame of history's final chapter, the story is sealed. It doesn't matter what came before. It doesn't matter what was said privately. The image overrides everything. The king knew that. He also knew something else most people don't like to admit out loud. Funerals rewrite narratives better than any interview ever could. They turn conflict into closure. They turn fractures into forgiveness. They turn unresolved tensions into a single, tidy image of unity. And that image lasts forever. That's why this wish wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't even about personal grievance. It was about preventing a narrative from forming that could not be undone once he was gone. Now look back at Harry. This is where his silence becomes devastatingly clear. Harry understands optics. He's lived inside them. He's fought against them. He knows exactly how a single photograph can erase years of context. He knows how quickly a moment can be weaponized, reframed, and sold as something it was never meant to be. So when Anne spoke, Harry didn't hear cruelty. He heard inevitability. That's why there was no argument. Because arguing would mean pretending the risk wasn't real. And Harry knows better than anyone how real it is. Ask yourself this. If you knew that one moment, one appearance, one carefully cropped image could permanently reshape your father's legacy, would you take that chance? Harry couldn't. Not without betraying the very thing he's always claimed to fight for, truth. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because the king's wish wasn't rooted in fear of disruption. It was rooted in fear of distortion. Fear that the final image would say something he never intended. Fear that silence after death would be filled by interpretations he could no longer correct. And Harry saw that. That's why his grief wasn't explosive. It was internal. It was the grief of a man realizing that some decisions are too final to be challenged, not because they're right, but because they're irreversible. The room felt it too. No one pushed back. No one demanded clarification. Because everyone understood what was really being protected here wasn't emotion. It was history. But there was still something missing. Something Anne didn't say. Something no one dared ask. A reason so volatile that speaking it aloud would have turned a boundary into a war. And Harry knew exactly what that unspoken reason was. Because he'd already heard it, long before this moment. And once you understand what was never said, you understand why this silence was the loudest part of all. The most powerful part of that room wasn't what was said. It was what was deliberately left out. No explanation. No justification. No emotional cushioning. Just a boundary, placed carefully, quietly, and without debate. That silence wasn't accidental. It was engineered. Because the moment a reason is spoken out loud, it becomes something people can argue with, defend against, dissect, deny. And whoever made this decision understood that some truths don't survive daylight. Not because they're false, but because they're explosive. So Princess and didn't say it. She didn't name it. She didn't reference it. She didn't even allude to it. And yet, everyone in that room felt it pressing in on them. Especially Harry. This is where the story takes its sharpest turn. Harry's tears were not the tears of a man shocked by betrayal. They were the tears of someone facing finality. The kind that settles in when you realize a door isn't just closing. It's being sealed shut forever. Think about it. If the reason had been simple, it would have been said. If it had been defensible, it would have been explained. If it had been petty, Harry would have pushed back. But none of that happened. Instead, Harry absorbed it. That tells us the reason lived somewhere far more complicated than blame. Somewhere buried under years of quiet tension, misalignment, and irreparable fracture. Something that couldn't be reduced to a headline without detonating everything around it. And here's the contradiction people struggle with. Harry is often portrayed as defiant, rebellious, willing to burn bridges to protect his truth. But in that moment, he did the opposite. He chose restraint. He chose silence. He chose not to force a moment that would have made everything worse. Why? Because arguing would have exposed the unspoken truth. And once that truth was exposed, there would be no way to put it back. So Harry did the only thing left. He let it stand. Not because it was easy, not because it didn't hurt, but because some battles, once fought, destroy more than they save. You could see the conflict written across his face. Loyalty pulling one way, love pulling another. And in the middle, a realization that some endings don't come with closure, they come with containment. This wasn't about winning. It was about preventing something from becoming permanent. That's what the king's last wish really represented. Not exclusion, not cruelty, not punishment. A final attempt to control the narrative when he no longer could. A final safeguard against a moment that would redefine everything after his death. And Harry understood that better than anyone. That's why he didn't speak. That's why his tears stayed contained. Because once this chapter closed, there would be no rewriting it. No clarifications. No corrections. No second chances. And as Princess and stepped back, duty fulfilled, and the room slowly exhaled, one truth settled in with chilling clarity. This wasn't the end of a feud. It was the end of a story that would never be told out loud. But what happens when silence becomes permanent? And what happens next when the cameras finally arrive? And that's the part no one wants to sit with. Because silence doesn't just end stories. It preserves them. When the room finally began to breathe again, nothing felt resolved. There was no relief, no sense of closure, just a heavy understanding that something irreversible had been set in motion, not loudly, not dramatically, but with precision. This was never about who was right or wrong. It was about containment. The king's last wish wasn't an act of rejection. It was an act of control in a moment where control was slipping away. He knew that after his death, he would no longer be able to clarify intentions, correct distortions, or push back against narratives formed in his absence. And funerals, of all things, are where narratives calcify. Harry knew that too. That's why his reaction matters more than the words themselves. A man who has spent years speaking out chose not to speak. A man who has fought institutions chose not to challenge this one. That isn't weakness. That's understanding the cost of noise when the stakes are permanent. Look back at the opening image. Harry standing still, eyes wet, mouth closed. Now you know why. Those tears weren't just for his father. They were for the finality of it all. For the knowledge that some things don't get fixed. Some relationships don't get healed. And some decisions, once made, aren't about justice. They're about damage control. Princess and didn't dramatize it because drama would have undermined the point. The point was to ensure that when the final chapter is written, it can't be rewritten by optics, speculation, or carefully framed photographs. And that's uncomfortable, because it forces us to ask questions we don't like asking. What if silence really is the most merciful option? What if restraint protects more than confrontation? What if love sometimes looks like letting something hurt without turning it into a spectacle? Harry's silence answered those questions without a single word. This wasn't surrender. It was acceptance. Acceptance that the king's final act wasn't about choosing sides. It was about choosing stability, about ensuring that his death didn't become another battleground, another headline war, another moment hijacked by interpretation. And now, that choice stands. Unchallenged, unexplained, permanent. But here's the thing that should linger with you. This was only one decision, one boundary, one final wish. And it tells us something far bigger about what happens next, about who controls the narrative when the king is gone, about which voices will be heard, and about which silences will speak the loudest. So I want to know what you think. If you were Harry, would you have spoken up or stayed silent? If you were the king, would you have made the same choice? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who sees both sides of this story. And if you want to follow what happens as these final decisions begin to shape the future of the monarchy, make sure you're subscribed. Because this wasn't the end. It was the last move the king could make himself. And what comes after is out of everyone's control.